What is that?
Teach
Acha,
for
Teach
India
for
film.
India. I see. Let me know when you're there. I'm still there for most of the week.
Sure. When is yours? When yours? Seven.
You were in Stephens, actually. I was there in Stephens
Oh, when were you there?
in 2007.
Oh, I was there between 12 and 15.
Okay.
Just come.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you.
yes, we can see. Yes,
Ma'am,
you
am I
were.
audible?
Yes,
Oh, I can't hear them.
we can hear you.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah. Namaste and a very warm welcome to everyone gathered here today. I, Deepesh Kurbu, am grateful to be here and share a glimpse of my 2 year journey in the Department of Philosophy. Pursuing a master's in Indian philosophy has been a deeply enriching experience academically, personally, and spiritually. The discussions, the constant support from our professors, and the friendship formed during this journey has shaped not just my thinking, but also my way of living. Indian philosophy has taught me that learning is not just about knowledge, it's about transformation. I'm truly grateful to this department for being a space of wisdom, challenge, and growth. Speaking of the Department of Philosophy at Mahe Manipal, it plays a vital role in integrating teaching and research activities in the humanities and social sciences through academic programs, projects, publications, and events at MISHA. It offers research-centric postgraduate and PhD programs, especially in Indian knowledge systems. In continuation of its commitment to research and dialogue, the department is organizing two insightful lectures along with a workshop today. We are honored to host a young and dynamic scholar, Professor Tarini Avasti, faculty in history and philosophy at Flame University, Pune. Dr. Avasti received her doctorate in ancient literature, religion, and culture from Cornell University, New York. She holds a master's in modern history from JNU and a bachelor's in history from St. Stephen's College. She has also taught undergraduate courses at Cornell University. Her doctoral research brings together the history of late Sanskrit intellectual culture with post-colonial theory. Her interests span Mimamsa, Yoga, Vedanta, Tantra, Buddhist epistemology, and Rama narratives. Among her publications are the illustrated Ramayana in the year 2020 and the translation from the Sanskrit for Shakti, an exploration of the divine feminine in the year 2022, both published by the Darling Kinsley Penguin Random House. We look forward to the insights and dialogue that today's session will bring. Once again, welcome and thank you for being part of this enriching academic occasion. You take off.
Sorry?
You'll take off.
Yeah, can I just keep sitting here?
Then because the camera is here.
Okay.
We can get the chair.
No, that's I can sit on that chair. It's fine. I was just settled. Thank you so much. That was very kind. To clarify, and I think also to kind of mm, yeah, to kind of set the tone for what we'll be doing here, hopefully over the next couple of days and today. I'm trained primarily as Nari. No, I'm sorry.
My name?
Yes.
Deepesh.
Deepesh, I'm so sorry. Like Deepesh said, I'm trained primarily as a historian. And the way I was trained to approach Sanskrit philosophy was also as an intellectual historian of Sanskrit literature and philosophy. So a lot of what I'll be saying over the next, especially today and tomorrow, will be kind of grounded in that. And then in the reading workshop, the idea is to kind of just read a section from either the Shloka Vartika or the Tantra Vartika. We can see how we want to go. And see what all of us from our different disciplinary contexts can get out of it. So today and tomorrow, I want to talk about a few trends in what I think of as the late second millennium in Sanskrit intellectual culture. Um, Today, I want to focus on a figure, Bhaskara Raya, and tomorrow, I want to focus on what I think of as a particular tendency of insincerity in play. And I don't mean them as pejoratives, I mean them as good things in the way we approach philosophy. These are not like you see some of those trends in Bhaskara Raya, but in tomorrow's talk, I'll be focusing on Apaya Dikshita and this 18th century Madhva figure called Ayyana. But back to Bhaskar. So I want to frame this a little bit. Usually we tend to think that, and I don't know if that's true anymore, but at least until a few years ago, until 15, 20 years ago, the impression was that Sanskrit philosophy kind of has its apogee sometime in the late first, early second millennium. And most things of interest begin to drop out by the 14th, 15th century. And whatever is there in Sanskrit philosophy after that is kind of a rehashing of what was already there. And it's dry and boring. And if you take nothing else from today and tomorrow, take away that Sanskrit philosophy continues to be very fun into the 18th and 19th, and honestly in the 20th century as well. Um, and the figure that I want to use today to think about this is Bhaskar Raya. Now, there was a project a few years ago that Sheldon Pollock ran, um, Indian Knowledge Systems on the Eve of Colonialism. What that project was very good at doing was that because they were trying to understand what it is that came before the colonial encounter, we have a lot of great scholarship emerging directly or indirectly from that project on 16th and 17th century Sanskrit philosophy. The work of figures like Andrew Nicholson, for example, who wrote Unifying Hinduism, where he focuses on Vijnana truths. It kind of grew out of that project. There's a lot of other works. I don't want to go into the details of that. But there were some other things with that project which required some critical engagement with which figures, for example, like Parimal Patil, in his work on Nyaya and Vaisheshika in the late pre-colonial period did. Um, and to my mind, the biggest desideratum that that project leaves out is that it says that we want to study what came just before colonialism to see how it was used in a post-colonial context, either or how it died out, right? So basically, they posit a rupture in the 18th century. Over the years, many scholars, including Andrew Nicholson, Michael Allen, in his way, Ayon Maharaj, Swami Medhananda, have begun to suggest that maybe there is a more complicated story to be told, not of a radical epistemic rupture, but of continuities and shifts. And that's something that I tried to do in my dissertation, and I'm trying to do in some little different ways as well. Um, but the other side, of course, is also that the 18th century or the 17th century, especially the 18th century in Sanskrit philosophy, was not a time just of rehashing existing ideas. If you look at Samuel Wright's work on Nyaya, he has also tried to trace what it is that's interesting about this period. And if you look at a figure like Bhaskara Raya, it becomes immediately apparent that um, this was not a person who was not engaging creatively with his material. He was bringing to bear new approaches, new ideas. He was integrating different systems in ways that had not been done before. And two, it is some of it is, I mean, a lot of it is philosophically significant in the sense that it's not just what Pollock has called, I think, I'm paraphrasing, I'm probably from memory, I'm probably going to misquote, but something like newness of form but oldness of spirit. It's clearly not that, right? So I'm going to talk about two aspects of Bhaskara Raya's work. I'll introduce him a little bit, but mostly I want to talk about his engagement with Advaita Vedanta and Mimamsa, both in his Vedanta and Mimamsa works, right? So, has any of you heard of Bhaskara Raya before? Okay. We are familiar with Sri Vidya Tantra, little bit, right? Okay. So Bhaskara Raya was one of the more influential exponents of Sri Vidya Tantra. Um, I think in the last 500 years, I guess the two most well-known Sri Vidya scholars were Lakshmi Dhar and Bhaskara Raya. Bhaskara Raya was active in the 18th century. He was probably born near the end of the 17th century. His father took him to Banaras to study a little bit. One interesting thing about this period, particularly after the 14th, 15th century, is that we know a lot of detail about these people's lives in a way that how much do we really know about how Sureshwaracharya lived or what he did or where, like even where he lived sometimes, right? Bhaskara, we know a lot of detail. So he studied in Kashi. Then he had some patrons who were kind of Maratha generals. He traveled around a lot. And at the end of his life, he received a land grant from the Tanjore Marathas in what is called Bhaskara Rajapuram. It's like a couple hours from Tanjore. And he settled there. In within Sri Vidya, he has commentaries on the Vamakeshwari Mat Tantra, the Vamakeshwari Mata, on some of the Shakta Upanishads like the Tripura Upanishad. He has also a commentary on the Lalita Sahasranam, which is quite popular, the Saubhagya Bhaskara. I think that's probably the best known commentary on the Lalita Sahasranam. He also did other kind of commentaries on the Ganesha Sahasranam and so on. He has some stotras and he has some independent works like the Varivasya Rahasya, which deals with some of the details of the Sri Vidya mantra, and the Bahya Varivasya Vidhi, which is only available in fragmented form, in fact, in fragments. But the interesting thing is that despite the fact that Bhaskar Rai is really well known as a Sri Vidya scholar, and Douglas Brooks has written about him, Khiste has written about him, a big part of Bhaskar Rai's scholarship was his Mimamsa, right? So two of his major Mimamsa works are thankfully extant, thank you, either partially or fully in manuscript form. And one of them is actually publicly available. Should any of you after this have a great itch to read more about Matu Artha Lakshana, I can send you a link. I somehow feel like that's not what's going to happen, but it's a fun work. So two major Mimamsa works. He wrote a commentary on Khandadeva's Bhattadipika, but he also added to it. So the Bhattadipika does not do Tarkapada. It starts in Arthavada. Shambhu Bhatta writes a long kind of introductory passage in commenting on 1-2 where he deals with some of the issues that come up in Tarkapada, but it really begins, it doesn't do 1-1. And of course, the Sankarsha Kanda is not traditionally commented on by Mimamsa scholars. What Bhaskara Raya does is he adds the Tarkapada to the Bhattadipika, and he also does the 4 chapters of Sankarsha. And he says now it's a full 16, and now it's Bhatta Chandrika, because, and then he writes a commentary on it called the Bhatta Chandrodaya, which is, I mean, we can go into what it does with Bhavana theory and so on. The other major Mimamsa work has a very interesting story, which is that Bhaskar Raya's Vidya Guru, he had a son called Swami Shastri, who was settled somewhere in Karnataka in a small court. And Bhaskar and I went to visit him, and this is a story that they tell in the opening of the text. He went to visit him, and this ruler was like, "Well, you guys are Mimamsakas, you're Shastrins. Why don't you show me what a Vada looks like?" And so they did, and they say Patra Mukhena, so through written notes, they write this nearly 600-page Vada text on the question of Matu Artha Lakshana, which we can talk about later in the talk, right? It's got to do with the statement Somena Yajeta. But so that was us. And if you look at that work, what's interesting about it is, of course, it is very sophisticated just in terms of the kind of examples it's bringing in, the way they're dealing with issues within Mimamsa. But it's also that he sometimes will very casually say, well, this is how it is in Mimamsa, and then in Uttara Mimamsa it is done this second way. And then the Bhakti Mimamsakas say this third thing. In a work of Mimamsa like the Vada Kautuhala is, it would be unheard of at any point between before the 17th century to casually raise an example from a Bhakti Mimamsa text, and we can talk more about that in a second. So broadly, Bhaskara Raya was, yeah. So he was writing this. He was a Tantrika. He was writing in Mimamsa. He also had a text on Vedanta, which is unfortunately lost. It is supposed to have been called the Chanda Bhaskara, the fierce sun. If anybody ever comes across a manuscript, please let me know. Um, it seems that some people had access. Anyway, um, I'm going to start with talking about what Bhaskara Raya does with Advaita Vedanta, and then I'll talk about a little bit about his Mimamsa work. What is interesting about Bhaskara Raya is that he's trying to integrate all of his works in different disciplines. What I mean by that is we'll talk about Apaya Dikshita tomorrow. When Apaya writes as a Mimamsaka, if you read the Vidhi Rasayana, you may be able to trace influences from his Vedanta works. You will not find a Vedanta view in the Vidhi Rasayana, ever. Right? When he's writing in Mimamsa, he's a Mimamsaka. When he writes as a Vedantin, he's a Vedantin, right? But when he's writing as a Mimamsaki, he's not also saying, well, this is the view of the Purva Mimamsakas, but in Uttara Mimamsa, we do things this way. Bhaskara Raya, when he is writing as a Mimamsaka, introduces ideas from Vedanta, from Bhakti, from, well, Tantra. We'll talk about how he locates Tantra. And also, of course, his Tantra writing is saturated with Mimamsa. You cannot read a page of Bhaskara Raya without coming across an example from Mimamsa. It's not possible. Um, Right. So when Bhaskar Rai talks, one of his main sort of one of the things that he's pushing back against in his tantra works is the idea of Jagan Mithyatva. Right. He treats it. He doesn't deal with it in great detail, the way we find in sort of in Vyasatirtha and so on. I don't know what he does in that lost work, right? Because he is supposed to have had a debate with the Vallabhites and I think also with the Madhva. We have nothing extant from it, unfortunately. I think it would be very interesting if we did, but such is life. But in his Tantra works, his major interlocutors are Advaita Vedanta, and he deals with it in a very interesting way, which is that um, he doesn't try to say that Advaita Vedanta is wrong, right? Now, this is something that's begun to happen in the last 300 years, which is that even people who disagree wildly with Shankara want to claim something of Shankara's authority, right? When Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya thought that Shankara was wrong, they would say Shankara was wrong, right? When Jiva Goswami wants to say Shankara was wrong, he says, well, Shankara was really an incarnation of Shiva, and he was only saying these things at the command of Vishnu. Of course, he is mistaken, but he doesn't really mean it, right? So there is the attitude changes a little bit. Similarly, in traditions like Sri Vidya, whose metaphysics is completely at odds with Shankara's, they don't want to give up Shankara completely, right? So they'll say, Shankara, I know he says this in the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, but he also wrote the Saundara Lahari, of course. And a big part of how you're able to do that is through the Shankara Digvijayas, for example, right? You can think about reasons for this. I have a few thoughts. We could talk about it. But Bhaskara is very much within that, right? He disagrees with Shankara, but he's not going to say that Shankara is wrong. No, 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 or that Advaita Vedanta is mistaken. The way he does it is he starts by saying that if you look at the Advaita Shrutis, um, like Nehana, Nasti Kinchana, etc., he interprets them to in such a way that he says what is being denied is bheda, right? Duality. What is not being denied is the external world, right? And he does it partly through heavily Navya Nyaya sized terminology. We can look at some examples if you want in a bit. But so he does that. The next step is so the Upanishad is on Bhaskara Raya's side, right? Including the statements that the Advaitins like very much. Then he says Gaudapadacharya, when he's talking about how there is nothing here and so on and so forth, is of course only denying Bheda and not Prapancha. And there he is clearly contradicting Shankara, who clarifies in his commentary there that, well, of course, he's talking about Prapancha. Then he says, if you look at the later tradition, right? So he quotes from the Panchapadika, where there is that passage about even though it appears to be different, it is really not. And I mean, there are links there with Apaya Dikshita, which tomorrow I'll talk about more. So he talks about that, and he says, look, even followers of Shankara really agree with me, right? And he also again he quotes from the Panchadashi and so on and so forth. So he now he has, and then he says, even Shankara in the Saundarya Lahari agrees with me. And then he cites certain passages from the Brahma Sutra where he says where Shankara is kind of it's and people have written about this, right? That Shankara is not always entirely easy to pin down. Sometimes he will take a few either Abhyupayavadas or positions where he doesn't necessarily want to fight that battle, right? So he will cite from this. And so he is basically saying, look, Upanishads agree with me, Gaudapada agrees with me, Shankara's followers agree with me, Shankara also sometimes agrees with me, right? So he has basically said, appropriated all of Advaita Vedanta for himself, and he's saying the problem is not any of this. The problem is that the Upanishads, he says, are not reading it as I am reading it, right? So he says that there are two views, the Tantrika view and the Upanishad view. And he says the Upanishad view is that there is pure awareness and everything is superimposition. Whereas the Tantrika view is that everything is in fact conscious because everything is a transformation of Shakti, right? Now, there are two or three questions that I'm interested in around this. One is that why does Bhaskara Rai need this, right? Why does he need Shankara? And if he needs Shankara, then why does he need to go to all this trouble why does he need for everything to be conscious, right? And I mean, why he needs Shankara, we can think of many ways. The Shankara Mathas had become very influential, they'd also become very important centers for Sri Vidya. Elaine Fisher has written about this. Excuse me. But the question of why he needs everything to be conscious, and this is very preliminary, I've only begun thinking about this in the last few months, so feel free to push back. It seems to me that you need Shakti in order for spiritual practice to make sense as an efficacious mode, right? Because one of the most difficult things about classical Advaita Vedanta is that there comes a point that you begin to ram your head against the idea that reality is non-dual and the fact of one's own phenomenal experience. And even though there are ways, of course, they talk about nididhyasana and so on, there is a point at which a practitioner begins to. So what Bhaskar Rai is able to do is he is able to the introduce Sri Vidya practice as real, whereas for Advaita Vedanta, of course, practice is anything that leads up to the non-dual experience can't be a cause and can't be ultimately real, right? So Bhaskara is able to do that with Shakti, with the mantra and so on. And of course, the mantra needs always to be vimarsha and conscious and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. Um, how does Bhaskara frame this larger thing, right? How does he locate the Upanishads versus the Tantras? So Bhaskara has a scheme. He says when you're a child, you learn the alphabet. Once you're done learning the alphabet, you don't keep learning the alphabet, you move on to Kavya, right? After you're done with Kavya, you study. Now Bhaskar Rai gets, so you study Nyaya, you study Mimamsa so that you know that there is a self, right, which is independent of the body. Then you do Vedic practices and so on. Then you start studying the Upanishad, and you do the vidyas that are described in the Upanishad. And then you once you know this is interesting, right? So once you're done with Upanishadic practices, that's when bhakti comes into play, right? So bhakti is placed higher there than the Upanishad, right? And there is a context to this which I'll talk about. And within bhakti, the highest bhakti is bhakti to Sri Lalita Tripura Sundari, para bhakti to Lalita Tripura Sundari, and that's kind of the completion, the fullness of one's spiritual progression. Now, this idea of Bhakti Mimamsa is older, of course, than Bhaskar Rai. Around the 17th century, Anand Venkatrishnan has written about this. His book just came out a few months ago, Love and Times of Scholarship. In the 17th century, you begin to have these Bhakti Sutra texts, the Shandilya Bhakti Sutra and the Narada Bhakti Sutra. And in about the 15th century, you have a text called the Bhagavan Nama Kaumudi, by a Lakshmidhara, which is different from the Sri Vidya Lakshmidhara. Um, Between these two, there has begun to develop this idea of, so you have Purva Mimamsa, Uttar Mimamsa, and Bhakti Mimamsa, right? So now you have three Mimamsas instead of the usual two. And Bhaskara Raya likes to employ this idea of three Mimamsas as if everybody knows it and it's always been there, right? So he'll just nonchalant, and of course in the three Mimamsas, right? Now, for each Mimamsa, Bhaskar Rai says there is a distinct. So, Purva Mimamsa deals with the Karma Kand of the Veda, Uttar Mimamsa deals with Upanishad, and Bhakti Mimamsa, he says, has all these other Upanishads. So, these are these what are called sometimes sectarian Upanishads, right? These later Upanishads, like the Tripura Upanishad, the Nrsimha Tapani, and so on and so forth, right? Similarly, he says, like Purva Mimamsa has the Smritis. Um, Uttar Mimamsa and Purva Mimamsa both have access to the epics, as again as Smriti. Bhakti Mimamsa, Bhaskar Rai says, has the Tantras, right? And he has these categories aren't always very neat. And then, of course, you have the three Mimamsas as hermeneutics for these three corpora. Right? So it is in that context that he talks about the relationship between the Upanishadas and the Tantrikas. So that's one thing. The other thing is that within his tantra works, he employs mimamsa, right? So it's very common in different Vedantas that you employ mimamsa nyayas when you're reading a passage, right? It's pretty normal. It's less normal in tantra, right? Tantrikas typically do not wear their mimamsa on their sleeve, even if they can do it. For example, Lakshmidhara, now the Saundara Lahiri commentator Lakshmidhara, in the 16th century, there is a passage where he's talking about a section in the Taittiriya where there is a description of a foot. And he says, of course, that's the foot of the goddess. And it's a mantra. So he says, and I know that the Mimamsakas will say that mantras are only to illumine existing objects in a sacrifice. But Shankaracharya has said, I don't know where I don't think Shankaracharya ever said this, but Shankaracharya has said this. They said that Siddhamannam Parityajya Bhikshamatati Durmatihi. So if you have the foot of the goddess which can grant you everything, why do you need this convoluted way of interpreting it as a mantra, figuring out what sacrifice it is part of, what element of the sacrifice it is illumining? You have this, you have the cooked fruit of the goddess's foot, right? That is Lakshmidhara's attitude towards Mimamsa, that the Mimamsakas are basically wasting their time. Bhaskar Rai's attitude is that, well, let me see how carefully I can employ different things from Mimamsa when I write. So, for example, there is a section in the Vamakeshwara where there is a discussion of having performed this japa, you should perform a certain sacrifice, right? And there is a description of the sacrifice. There are other commentaries on that verse. Nobody has ever cared about the primacy of the japa versus the fire offering. Bhaskar Rai being the Mimamsaka, the hierarchy is very important to him, right? Because it says Japtva, it's the Twa suffix, it says Japtva and then Yajeta, something like that. Bhaskar Rai says, well, there is a section in Mimamsa where it says Vajapayena Ishva Sautramanya Yajeta, or I might be getting some of the words wrong, but having performed the Vajapaya, one should offer with the Sautramani. In that section in Mimamsa, I think it's in chapter 4, the Siddhanta is that, by the way, if at any point you feel like I'm going off on a tangent or if you feel like you want a clarification, feel free to ask, right? I would, since there's so few of us, I don't see the point of doing a talk. So he says, so the text says, having sacrificed with the Vajapaya, one should sacrifice with the Sautramani. The Mimamsa Siddhanta on that sutra, in that Adhikarana, in I think chapter 4, is that the Twa suffix is actually, we usually think of Twa as implying a temporal relation, right? Having done this, one should do this. After this, you do that, right? They say that it's actually not for that because for reasons of prakarana and so on. They say this is actually implying a relationship of subordination, right? Now, if I tell you, having closed a door, bring me a pen, right? The instinct is to think that the point is to bring me the pen, and I'm only asking you incidentally to close the door, right? You would not think that bringing the pen is somehow subordinate to closing the door, right? Make sense? The Mimamsa Siddhanta is exactly the opposite. In that particular sentence, they say that by the Twa, what is meant is that the Sautramani is actually subordinate to the Vajapaya, right? It's counterintuitive as Mimamsa Siddhantas usually are. Um, we should have done one on Mimamsa, but that's okay. We'll read Mimamsa on whatever Wednesday, right? Right. So Bhaskara now applies this principle, right? And he says when it says having performed the japa, you should do the fire offering. It means that the japa is the prime, just like in the Sautramani example from Mimamsa, the japa is the primary thing and the homa is subordinate to the japa, right? That's one way in which he applies Mimamsa. Right? This is kind of, it's how you read things. If you're a, if you, in Vedanta as well, you do this all the time. You draw upon examples from from Purva Mimamsa. That's one way. But Bhaskara Raya never really takes issue in his Tantra works with Mimamsa metaphysics or Mimamsa soteriology, right? He doesn't start to fight about what the Mimamsakas think about liberation versus what Tantrikas think about liberation. He does have that argument with Advaita Vedanta, right? And again, when he says Vedanta, it seems very obvious that he has in mind when he says Upanishada, he means Shankara Advaita. We can talk about why that's the case because clearly he knew Madhvas, he knew Shiva Vaishnavas. I think, but so anyway, that's a separate conversation. But he does want to push back on Advaita Vedanta views on liberation, on the kind of results that you can have, and the general. So, for example, there's the Jagat Vyapara Varja Adhikarana in Vedanta, right? It's depending on how you count the last or the second to last Adhikarana in the Brahma Sutras, where it is said that you do all these practices, what you will get is you'll get the same capacities as God, but you won't get the capacities of creation, preservation, and destruction of the world, right? The Jagat Vyapara, the cosmic operations, you don't get access to. In the tantras, it is often said that if somebody, so in right at the beginning of the Vamakeshwara, there's a passage where it is said, if you perform a practice, even one syllable of this, you become equal to Shiva, Brahma, etc. Again, no, none of the earlier commentators has ever been bothered by this, except Bhaskara Raya, who deliberately introduces the Jagat Vyapara Varjadikarana. He says, well, I know they say that in the Brahma Sutra, but these are superior practices to that, right? And even though you can't get it through Upanishadic Vidyas, you can get it through serving the goddess or through worship of the goddess. So it seems like he feels the need to push back more against Vedanta because the Vishaya, the scope, is the same, right? With Mimamsa, you can say that that is okay for Karma Kanda, but for liberation, this is what you should do. You can't get rid of Advaita of Vedanta that easily because you're both concerned with liberation. So he has to deal with that at greater length. On to his actual Mimamsa works, like I said, we talked a little bit about the Bhatta Deepika. We do have a board. Can I use the board? Okay. So, is that okay? Okay. So, there is a section in Khandadeva where he talks about this statement. We might not need a lot of it, but I'm operating under the assumption that everybody has Sanskrit. That's fair, right? That's not unfair on my part. Good. Okay. Many people may have come across this sentence. Somena yajeta? One should sacrifice with soma, right? Oh, sorry, I feel like I've played it down. The traditional Mimamsa, now there is this principle in Mimamsa of Vakya Veda. What we absolutely never want as Mimamsakas is for one sentence to enjoin at once two things, right? So in this sentence, now for Mimamsa, Yajeta has to be interpreted, this is discussed in the Bhavartha Vikarana in Mimamsa, as Yagena Bhavageta. So basically the verbal ending, right, in this case the optative, has to be read as bhavana, to bring into being, right? And the verb root becomes the karana, right? That's how verbs in injunctive statements are interpreted in Mimamsa. Now, so Somena Yagena Bhavageta. Now there is a problem immediately, right? Because one sentence cannot both enjoin that you bring the result yagena phalam bhavani, right? So the same sentence cannot both enjoin that you bring into being the result through sacrifice, as well as enjoin that you bring into being the sacrifice or the result with soma, right? Because it would enjoin two things, and we always want to avoid barking. So the traditional Mimamsa interpretation of the sentence for basically 1,000 years until Khandadeva in the 17th century was Somavata Yagena. Basically, Somavata Yagena Phalam Bhavani, right? So there is something called the Matut suffix, which is a possessive suffix, right? So like we are just like Balavat, right? We are Somavat. So what that does is that then there is only one thing that is being enjoyed. You bring the result into being with the sacrifice, which has soma. Right? So soma doesn't have to construe independently with the bhavani. Right? Basically, this makes sense. Right? Now Khandadeva comes along and says, Mitra has written about this. Khandadeva comes along and he says, well, actually, you don't really need this suffix, right? So you don't need to read somena as somavata. Now, why would you not want to read the suffix? Because that involves what we call lakshana. Right? And lakshana figurative indication. What do people in this room like to translate? What do you like to do for lakshana? You don't like implication.
Connotation.
You like connotation. Okay. So you have to connote, and you always want to avoid connotation if you can. So Khandadeva says that it's very easy. You don't have to go through all this trouble. You can you can have two moments of cognition, right? In the first cognition moment, you read the instrumental on Somena, and you obviously, because if you're a well-trained Mimamsaka, you read the instrumental on Yagena. You just see that there are two instruments and there is a bhavana, right? That's your first cognition. In the second order, Parshika cognition, you then read both of these. You interpret how they connect with the bhavana only in the second one, and this becomes basically that you produce a result with the yaga, which is then collected with the bhavana as an instrument via the yaga. Right? And this is grounded in something that Parthasarathi says, which is that this gets kind of involved. But anyway, that all the karakas can only construe with the kriya. Karakas cannot construe with one another except by way of the kriya. So that's kind of the broad picture. This is the question that they take up in the Vadakaudhukala, right? So when Bhaskar Rai and his friend Swami Shastri sit down and they say, well, we want to write this little co-authored book on the question, on some Mimamsa issue that will please the ruler. I don't know if they stayed together or if they were communicating over letters. My suspicion is that they might actually have stayed together in that place for the duration of the composition of this text. But this was the question that they deal with. And Swami Shastri takes a traditional Mimamsa position that you have to have the Matut suffix. And Bhaskar Rai takes a Khandadeva S position again. He's a Khandadeva Anuyayi insofar as there is such a thing. He does a sub-commentary with these. And so he says that no, you don't need it. And they spend 600 pages on this. So obviously, they're not just talking about this, right? They're bringing in other questions. So, for example, in Bhadar 5 and 6, they get into the question of how number construes with the verb, right? In Saptadasha, Prajapatya, and so on. However, what's interesting to me, there are two interesting things about this text to me. One is what I already said. In certain discussions, when they're talking about Karanas and so on, he will very casually, both of them, they'll start talking about the Bhakti Mimamsakas, and that's usually they mean Lakshmikara of the Bhagavad Nama only. He has all these instruments, and they'll start citing from the Bhagavata Purana. You've all read some Mimamsa, right? Okay, those of you who have read some Mimamsa, from any time between the 16th century, ought to be slightly shocked that you can quote from the Bhagavata Purana in a Mimamsa work. It's hard to convey how much it would. Anyway. But the other thing is that even on the, so this is okay, fine. This could just be stylistic, or it could be a result of Bhakti Mimamsa becoming important. To my mind, the bigger intervention almost, which I'm still working out how it works, is that he says that bhavana, which is this all-important idea in Mimamsa, is actually the will of the goddess, right? And this is an idea that he develops in a later part of the Vadakautumala that I'm still, like I said, I'm still working that out, but which he also cites in his Tantra works. So when he's talking about how Mimamsa works and how Karma Kanda works, he says, and of course I've already shown in the Vadakautumala that Bhavana is nothing but the will of the goddess, right? This to me suggests two things. One is that he's drawing it to him, the kind of work that Mimamsa does belongs to a distinct domain than what I think of as the salvific pursuits that are involved in the Upanishad or particularly in Sri Vidya or in Tantra practice or in Bhakti. And the other thing it suggests to me is that he thinks of Mimamsa not only as a distinct system, which many people do, but as a system that is comprehensible through Sri Vidya, in the sense that you can there is this the ultimately true metaphysics belongs to Sri Vidya, and you can apply that to interpret everything, including Advaita Vedanta and Mimamsa, right? So, how does this tie up with the larger argument about the eve of colonialism? Is that what I said? Eve of colonialism, eve of colonial encounter, whatever it is I said. There are a few trends in Bhaskara, and one, these using these relatively recent texts, like the Bhakti Sutras, or like the Shankara Digvijayas, which are again mid to late second millennium, to use, we'll talk about it more tomorrow, to use Appaya Dikshita, the influence of Appaya Dikshita, right? The second thing that I see as important, which has begun to happen already before the colonial encounter, is a shift in the way you approach Shankara, right? The third thing, which I want to develop more tomorrow, is a certain way of reading which you can push back on whether you think it's insincere and playful or not. But clearly, he's reading, when he's saying that this is what Gaudapada meant, Bhaskara Rai knows that that's not how Gaudapada is read by Shankara or by Advaita Vedantas. Bhaskara Rai can't possibly think that any Advaita is actually going to be convinced by this, right? And my suspicion, there's no way to prove it except by how we are reading Bhaskara Rai and what we think is possible for Bhaskara Rai. I don't see any reason to think that Bhaskara Rai genuinely thought that that's how Gaudapada ought to be read. Right? I think it's a way for him to say, if I really want, I can show you how I can make this work. Right? This is obviously a judgment that I am making. You can disagree with me on this. But I think, again, we can talk about this more tomorrow when I trace many different people using similar strategies. And maybe then we can fight about it more. I think ideas of insincerity in play don't go down very well with Indian philosophy audiences sometimes. So there is this kind of reading practice that, again, I think Appaya is a very important figure in how they begin to become prominent. There's that. Then there is a way of thinking across systems, right? I mean, including the status structure, but even independently of that. You want to be a Mimamsaka when you're a Sri Vidya practitioner, right? Some of these trends you actually see into the colonial and even sometimes the post-colonial periods. And I mean, I've tried to in my work show it through the example of Sri Vidya and 2 or 3 different authors of Sri Vidya and how they interpret it. But that's kind of where I want to go with this, which is that there are some new interesting things happening. There are both sort of in terms of hermeneutics, in terms of philosophy, people are doing things in new ways to say new things. They're not just saying old things in a new terminology, like people often accuse them of doing, but you're just adding Navinaya and stirring. It's not just that. There are genuinely new ideas, and we can think about why. We can think about why these particular ideas are emerging at this time. But I feel like before that, we have to acknowledge that these ideas are emerging and kind of make sense of them. I think is that a good place to start talking, or yeah? Okay, thank you. Questions, comments, thoughts? Please.
Yeah, thank you first for coming here and
Thanks for having me.
sharing with us your research. Um, there are different things that would be interesting for me to clarify, because I have no idea about that person. But perhaps about him, and then afterward I will have a reflection about the way you say he's quoting. I think to me that's relevant. I think share something. I don't think it's particular to him. And
Sure.
I don't think it's controversial to say that people quote the way they want, disregarding the sources. I think it's done continuously.
Sure. I mean, but I think, sorry, please.
No, so actually, for one thing, so which is Saka when he wants to be, or advise him in that sense. But so for me, when we go and I mean, when I'm trying to assess the value of the thought and its influence, if we take Jamini, I go with there 2,000 years over, let's say, of quoting him in work, and so there's, whether you like it or not, people liked it, right? That makes it meaningful. But this person, I don't know. So what? Who is he? I mean,
Okay, fair.
right. So why should we know him? For example, for me, just as clarity.
Sure. One, we should know him because he actually is already pretty well known in Sri Vidya circles. I mean, his Sri Vidya works are still widely read. He had, at least for a couple generations, I mean, he had a few very good students and disciples who wrote their own important Sri Vidya works. For example, a commentary on the Parashurama Kalpa Sutra, which again continues to be popular.
Is some tantra.
It's a fairly prominent tantric tradition, which has, I mean, it has associations with the Kashmiri Shaiva tradition, but it's also very prominent in both Srungeri and Kanchi. So, I mean, he's important like that. He has living lineages of disciples. So, if you're assessing in terms of whether people like him or not, people like him quite a bit.
So he's used, people like.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in as much as I love Mimamsa, I think in contemporary times, more people are likely, more sort of non-academics are likely to have read Bhaskar Rai than Shabara, if that's how we're doing this, which I don't think is necessarily the best way to do this. So he's important for that reason, one. Two, if you look at his manuscript, like his works and how they circulated, they seem to have been quite popular. There is at least one commentator on the Bhatta Deepika, Vansheshwari Ajwan, who draws extensively upon Bhaskar Raya's earlier commentary, right? And the Bhatta Deepika itself is, of course, we know, it becomes the go-to primer, even more than the Shastra Deepika for Mimamsa.
So I know of a Bhaskara, isn't the same, but you say Bhaskara, I know of Bhaskara. I'm just wondering if it's the same person.
What did he do?
I don't, that's what I'm trying to, I know of a Bhaskara, I thought he was somehow.
Guru Mata.
Prabhakar, I don't know, I know that name.
You're not thinking about the Vedantin Bhaskara after Shankara.
Maybe it is a.
Yeah, no.
So it's not the same
Yeah,
one.
different level.
This one is 18th century.
1,000 years apart.
Okay, so I'm just
Yeah.
making.
Sure.
That part, okay.
But Bhaskara is a fairly common.
Yeah, Bhaskara, that is the Veda one.
Yeah.
That is after Shankara, immediately after.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
He is in the 9th century.
I thought the name with the devil, that's not him, we're talking about the very recent. All right, so in that context,
Yeah.
he is
But
contemporary.
I mean, I will add that there is a way in which we can't apply the same standard that we apply to even if we think that it's important how much one is quoted or how much influence one has had, which I mean we can talk about whether that's the best way to assess the 44 figure, but I think it's Bhaskar I simply did not have enough time. Like a counterfactual I sometimes like to play is that, well, Apaya we can see his influence in the 200 years, 300 years after, right? We haven't really had, I mean, even if we admit that Sanskrit intellectual, I mean, I don't think Sanskrit intellectual traditions die out in the 18th century, like, but we just haven't had enough time, I think, to assess what would have, if Bhaskar Rai had, if we move everything up 200 years, right? If Bhaskar Rai had been a contemporary of Appaya,
No, but you mentioned basically he wrote something, I mean, quite a lot, it seems, and then there is a continuity of his work, or people are engaged with it, and it kind of affects the way they practice.
oh yeah,
potentially,
absolutely, yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah.
So, because there is a tendency sometimes of finding that particular intellectual that nobody knows about, and you know what I mean? And then-
I know. But I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that tendency as well. For example, Bhaskar Rai's Mimamsa works, um, they haven't really been published or studied at all. Partly because people tend to assume that late Mimamsa is either dead or boring. Partly because in general, Mimamsa is not the most popular thing in the world. Although I did just attend a Kumarila conference, so things are changing, I think, for the better. I think clearly that it's important. But late Mimamsa especially doesn't get a lot of attention. The works haven't been published. So, I do think that there is value because sometimes you read stuff and you find something important. And I think the Vadakautuhala especially is important. And it was clearly circulating because we do have manuscripts in a variety of places.
And for you, like how much of it is philosophical and not purely theology? Say, when I hear this, I can think back of theological scribbles between priests in the Middle Age about interpretation of this ritual and that ritual, or that rule and this and that. Basically, how much angels go through the head of the needle. You can write 600 pages on that as much as you want.
So,
how much are we dealing with
sure.
philosophy?
So here's the thing with, again, I might be saying something obvious, feel free to stop me. The thing with Mimamsa, to my mind, is that we're never really arguing, except in one or two cases in the entire, Dvadash Lakshani Mimamsa, we are never really arguing about how to perform a ritual. Nobody is confused about how to interpret this sentence in practice terms, right? What they're interested in is how language works, right? And to that extent, again, I'm not in the business of deeming things philosophical or not, simply because I'm not a philosopher by training, and I sometimes feel like we define philosophy too narrowly. I'm also, I don't think theology is necessarily philosophically insignificant. But in the case of Bhaskara Raya's Mimamsa works, I would say that because the focus is so much on how the cognitive process works, right? In terms of this, again, coming from Khandadeva, these two orders, these two stages of cognizing the instrumental in a sentence and how one processes it, and so on and so forth. I think, to me, that can be read philosophically. But again, I'm not super. It's not a big concern for me whether or not it strikes to contemporary philosophers as philosophy or not.
Involves cognition, which at least for analytical.
Yeah, they tend to like this stuff, but I think there are many things in the world that are important, even if analytic philosophers don't like them. And I'm perfectly comfortable working with them.
And maybe coming to what I found is closer to my own work. I think the text I can give it to others as question, but so you say the way he's quoting is not necessarily the way people.
Right. So I wanted to clarify. Thank you for that. Actually, I wanted to clarify on that. That it's not that people don't quote whatever they like, however they like throughout. But I think what shifts, and again, I see the shift in Appaya beginning around Appaya's time, and I think Appaya instigates some of it, is that he wants the reader to be in on the game, right? It's not insincere. That's why I say insincerity and play, right? He's not just trying to pass these things off. He wants you to know that obviously this is not how this is read, right? Obviously you're not going to be convinced, but look what I can do. Again, this last bit is something that I hope tomorrow to demonstrate it through a bunch of examples across office. But that, I think, is distinctive to my mind, to this period.
And that's perhaps what I find interesting in my outlook. Sometimes it's more historiographical than philosophical, and I've seen little interest in philosophers in that. I call it irony, right? So
Yeah.
being able to ironically engage with, from the authors, ironically engaging with their sources, sometimes to make fun of them, it's explicit, and or to whatever, to play with the meaning. But I think doxographers in India have been doing this for a long time.
Could you give me an example?
Yeah, I was about to, and one that could be meaningful for you would be Viveka. So 7th century
Sure, yeah,
Buddhist Madhyamikan is the first one to refer to Vedanta as Vedanta outside of the Vedic fold. So I think at least if only for that is significant, but kind of a second Nagarjuna also. So his work is very important.
Is it okay? I thought I could be mistaken. My impression was that the passages. You're okay. I mean, I have other questions about this. I'm curious. I know King talks about those passages where he refers to Vedanta, to Advaita. Um, my impression, I don't remember where I read this, was that those texts were not necessarily thought to be authentic works of. You think they were? I mean, you think they were that early? You think they were that the reference to Vedanta as Vedanta? You think okay?
It's very authentic.
Okay, you think okay. Thank you, because that's something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, it's not I. It's
Okay.
work of, its main work of Swami Viveka, he was actually head of a monastery here
Sure, yeah,
in
yeah.
this region. At that time, it's called Madhyamika Hridaya Karika. It
Hmm.
has an entire, it begins with the Buddhist schools and then moves into non-Vedic
Yeah.
Mimamsa being the last, that's the one he hates. Right? That's actually interesting there because there is irony. So my work, my previous book deals with Doxographer, particularly him as one chapter, and that chapter on the Mimamsa. And there, what you find in the Mimamsa, you would not recognize Mimamsa, right? But it has a lot of what you call, when you see, not necessarily the Puranas, but everything that involves rituals, so the Tantras, the yoga, and so forth, he puts it all into Mimamsa to make fun of it, and
Right.
to ridicule it. But the Vedanta is a previous chapter, so before Mimamsa, it deals with Vedanta, and there it's more or less Gaudapada.
Okay.
It's kind of a response to Gaudapada, actually.
Which is, I mean, interesting to me. So you're saying this is 7th century,
Yeah.
and you think he knew Kumarila?
This I would not know, right? Because I didn't engage with that
Sure,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah.
theology, so I didn't try to find passages here and there. Technically, you won't recognize Mimamsa very much in his Mimamsa chapter, because there's all. You find things that look like the Gita, for example. You find the idea of retracting your limbs like the turtle,
Yeah.
which yoga and some others you wonder why is that in Mimamsa. I have my theory here. The reason I was mentioning it is that for him as a doxographer, but also for other doxographers in time, when they deal with their sources, in my view, they don't really care if it's good represented. I think they take a lot of leeways, in going about it, which unfortunately contemporary philosophers working hand in hand with philology are unable to see through. They take it for cash, and then they say, "Oh, but he's a bad historian, or he's a bad historiographer, or a bad philosopher." I think that's misrepresenting what's happening there. It's kind of, I mean, here my colleague might frown on what I'm going to say, but beyond the doxographers, I think there are people like Madhavas interpreting the Upanishads and others. There is a big, there's a big play, let's say, with the text and making it say what you want it to say. That's,
But so here's my question, and I mean, I'm because you see certain kind of play also in other kinds of figures. You see other kinds of insincerity. For example, anyway, but in case of doxographers, my impression is usually, I mean, there's two things, right? One, I think it's a slightly different exercise than what I think Appaya or Bhaskara Rai are doing in terms of how they're relating to those disciplines, right? Because Bhaskara is not just talking about Advaita Vedanta to dismiss it, but to actually appropriate it, right? Similarly, when Appaya does it with Shrikantha, he does something similar. Um,
That's true. If you want, just on
yeah,
that,
no, but let me
yeah,
sort of,
finish it.
yeah. But the other thing is, to my mind, is that for me, both Bhaskar Rai and Appaya are operating under the assumption that the audience is in on the game. Do you think that's also true of?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because they, I mean, that is perhaps my, on that, and there are not many people working on photography, right? So there is, you mentioned Ian Nicholson, pretty standard, this photography.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Nicholson, he talks about doxography, but his work is not, it's about other things. It's not really about it.
He
Yeah.
just talks about it.
Yeah.
Basically, there's nobody working on doxography.
Yeah.
There was me. And then there are papers on doxography. And, but the way I see those texts, to having looked at a few. Actually, I have another paper in which this kind of question will be discussed. That is coming on the Indian philosophical pottery.
Okay, thank you.
I
That's
hope it
helpful.
comes out this year. If it does, I can send it.
Yeah, please.
And I make a kind of overview what has been done since my work, and I have a few more questions. But yes, I present the idea that they also appropriate a little bit, if you want, they, all the darshanas that they present, because they create, they use them as a kind of pathway to truth, to Samyak Gyan, or some Samyak Darshan, more or less. And it depends where they put it in their line, that they are, the way they want to convey their message. So particularly advisors type or writing type of photographers tend to appropriate all of the Vedic thought to show that it's a scheme leading to their own view. So that's 100% appropriation.
That's, I mean, that's kind of, like what Hacker calls inclusivism, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, if you want.
But I mean, I know, he has.
Like, because inclusivism, it seems kind of the technical way of using it, it's positive, right?
Right.
Yeah,
I know. But I think Hacker also uses it as a negative.
I would have to see.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think he means exactly what you're saying.
The way inclusivism, in a way that I think when the image I take in the book on doxography, when the Queen of England puts the crown on her head, they are the main jewels from the different lands that she has conquered.
Yeah.
One of them being the Indian big diamond. That's inclusivism.
That's about how he means it.
Yeah.
That's what he means by it.
That's so as that far. So when the Advaitin doxographers took the jewels from all of them, they put them on their crown. And it's funny because that actually the jewel metaphor appears in Gaurapada and in Bhaviveka, right? So Gaurapada, we start saying everything that the Buddha says that's good about it is in the Veda. And Bhaviveka will come back and say everything that is in the Veda that is valid is word of the Buddha. The rest, I mean, it's like jewel in a partnership, literally.
We should maybe, I don't know, Kumarila and Shankara both have fun things to say to that. But that takes us. But I mean, so sorry, I don't want to kind of, because I am interested in this very much, but I also want to hear from others. But I do want to say that, and maybe after we can talk later. And maybe we should talk about it after tomorrow's thing. But to my mind, what is different is that they're not appropriating in the way a doxographer appropriates, right? It's not like it's building up to that, right? It's more that they're saying exactly what I'm saying, in fact, right? Not that it is a way on, it is a moment on, it's a point on the path that leads to this ultimate reality. They're already in agreement with me, right? I mean, I don't know, we can maybe talk about this more after I kind of present Ayyana and Appaya tomorrow with Bhaskar Rao. But thank you, this is very helpful, thanks. Because I am kind of, I've been, Bronner and Becquerel talk about it in Appaya's context in their first word, last words book about insincerity in play. So it is something that a few of us are looking to build in some ways, but yeah.
The way you're suggesting to me feels like what any theologian would do, right? Because you can invent anything about any text, but the only thing you need to do is to build up authority, right? You have to show that I can link this back to some authority, right? So you have to show that I'm not actually saying something that others would go against. They are just all saying like me, right? So people read today in German, for example, Yoga Sutra in a very fancy manner.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with the text. They also do that. Yes, so India, Atha Pradipika, whatever, Yoga Pradipika, there is this, I do the same. And Patanjali do this.
But the thing is that Bhaskara already had a tradition to do that with the Sri Vidya tradition, right? Why draw in Mimamsa and Advaita, which no Sri Vidya author ever had wanted to do? Like I said, Lakshmidhara is just like, who are the Mimamsakas? Like, for all I care, right?
Yeah.
So there is, I mean, again, maybe with Ayyana and Appaya it makes more sense. I don't know. But thank you. This is very helpful. Thanks so much. And does anyone have? There is a question, and is there something? Do we find any archaeological sources? Yes. So we do. If you look in, I mean, I think there's a Tamrapatra or something which describes a grant that he was given, and his patronized. I mean, his individual writings. I don't know. I mean, I think again the Vadakautuhal clearly was a funded project. He got a grant to do it. We should all get grants to write 600-page books on Matvartha Lakshana. But yeah, so he was given a land grant by one of the Tanjavur Marathas. If you look in Douglas Brooks's book, The Secret of the Three Cities, he actually has a transcript of the land grant there, if that helps. Thank you. There actually also the village that you can actually go to the village that Bhaskar Rai was given. If you're ever in Tanjore, it's like a couple hours. There's nothing much there, unfortunately. I mean, there is a little temple, but that's later. But I think his descendants still live there. They don't do any Mimamsa. I kind of thought it would be like the village that Banabhatta describes at the beginning of. It was nothing like that. People weren't sitting around arguing over Mimamsa Nyayas. But yeah, I hope that helps. Thank you.
So far, I don't know much about Mimamsa, but as we compare with Tantra and Advaita and the concept of Bhakti Mimamsa to Tantra, and even the Bhavana, as you mentioned, like will of God, will it more incline towards the acceptance of Veda than Diveda? Like how it relates to Advaita?
Right. This acceptance. So yeah, so there is this category that Brooks talks about of a Vaidika Tantrika, right? Which includes people like Lakshmidhara, like Bhaskara Raya, who are invested in, rather than thinking of Veda and Tantra as distinct systems, into bringing them closer and closer together. And these are often people whose own personal sort of socio-cultural milieu is extremely kind of Vedic ritualist in that sense. Lakshmidhara does not try to do it systematically in the way he writes, right? I mean, he's vaguely Vedic and he acknowledges, but he doesn't do it systematically in the way Bhaskar Rai does. So yeah, absolutely, they are trying to have this, or Bhaskar Rai is trying to have this kind of model where the Veda and the Tantra are part of the same system. Uh, Patuknath Shastri Khiste has a paper on it in Sanskrit. I think it's called like Bhaskar Rai, I think Vedash Tantra Yoho Samanvaya or something, that you can maybe look at. Right? And I mean, Brooks does a little bit on it, but I think he doesn't talk enough about um, Mimamsa, I think. But yeah, does that help? Okay. Also, on the question of Bhavana, I mean, Bhavana, just to clarify, nobody except Bhaskara Rai thinks that it has anything to do with the will of the goddess. It's just Bhaskara Rai. Usually, it's just this idea of bringing into being, and there's a lot of controversy. So, Mandana wrote a text called the Bhavana Viveka, where I mean, the question is, there are many questions, but in the broader history of Bhavana, beginning with at least Kumarila, if not Shabara, coming all the way down to Bhaskara Raya. There's lots of issues around, is Bhavana the effort, is Bhavana the. So it's a complicated question. If you're interested, Khandadeva in the Mimamsa Kaustubha at the end of the Bhavarthadikarana has a long section where he just goes on a huge tangent about Bhavana. There's Andrew Ollitt's paper also on, I think it's called What is Bhavana? That might be helpful.
That Bhavana issue, was this the one that they sat in debate and started writing about, and that's Bhavana issue came up? You say there was this moment where they wanted to write Bhavana. No, you said that this Paskara person and some of his friends.
Yeah.
They started to make a Vada.
Yeah.
And that came out, this Bhavana issue came
So-
out from there.
No, so the Bhavana issue has been around for 1,000 years by this point.
Not this, I mean, yes, but the writing of it.
So it comes out there, but it also comes out in his Bhattadipika commentary. When he comments on 2.1, he kind of works through the views of Someshwar and Parthasarathi. And actually, that's also quite interesting. I don't know, but what's interesting about that section to me is that he talks about Someshwar and Parthasarathi and Mandana's views, and then he interprets them in such a way that he says, actually, they're disagreeing over very little, and it's only they're getting caught bogged down in the details, and they're actually not at variance at all, which I feel like as a sort of, it's not a super common move, this kind of reconciliation in Sanskrit Shastra, to my knowledge, where you say, well, we can, if we interpret them just right, they're kind of not that far apart.
What I find interesting, I don't know how you would find me if it's meaningful to you, but it seems that the kind of Vada they did there wasn't necessarily the Vada we would expect from, say, definition from the Sutra, this Vada debate. It would be rather kind of Upanishadic Vada.
Sorry, so these are two. So the Bhavana question comes up there. The Vada is not actually about Bhavana. It talks about Bhavana, but centrally it's about the connotation of the possessive suffix in Sominaya Jita.
And then within that comes this Bhava.
Bhavana is one of the, obviously it's an issue if you're talking about how the sentence is working, the Bhavayena becomes an issue. But it's actually quite close, I feel, to the Nyaya type of Vada, actually, because one, they're not opponents, right? They're trying to figure out that if you read it, they're responding very precisely to, so, Swami Shastri will have a long thing with 7 arguments. Bhaskara will respond to each of those 7 and then introduce 3 more and so on. It does read like, I don't think it's completely at.
It doesn't need to be completely different.
Yeah.
All I'm trying to suggest is that there's this nice paper from Broncos on the old way of doing Vada, right? More, if you want Vedic, Upanishadic type, and you'll be around say, what is number 1? And then number 1 is this and that. And it would be the debate will be who is able to name as much as possible, right? And it will go by analogies to this and this, and there's so many types of possibilities. And I thought it would be interesting if he comes up with a new idea around Bhavana in the context. In a sense, you could win debate by making new links that are there but are not seen, right? In that sense, it differs a little bit from the Vada the strict Vada, say from the Nyaya Sutra, to a more Vedic type, where it's about the ability to create new link and to show, if you want to show off knowledge, right?
I think the way I see what you mean, and I see I see what you're saying in terms of, one, yes, it is absolutely about showing off how many examples from 9th chapter I can cite. But there's also, there's a bit of a history to this as well, right? As you know, so Apaya has his Vada Nakshatra Malas, with the Purvottara Mimamsa and the Paniniya. And then there are all these, we do have some kind of records of how Vadas were conducted in the early modern context amongst people from different schools. The difference, of course, here is that this is a completely friendly debate. And Appa, as you know, is like, we're only pretending to compete. Of course, I can't actually compete with my gurus. But I do see what you mean about this being different from. I think it's some kind of a hybrid, I would say. Yeah.
It's very late, but it's interesting to have this.
Yeah.
And it has this also the connotation where they were given something, right?
Yeah.
So it's very in the frame of these old, because in the old days, the one who names the most, he gets the cows, right? So now the one who shows off the more, and he wins, this land grant maybe, or that they already had, or something.
No, this had nothing. This was just like they were just playing almost. Yeah.
Okay.
It's very interesting. Bhaskar Rai wins it, and at the end he says, I know I've won, but of course it's not. Actually, the guru side will always win, and I'm sure he's right. The traditional position is really true, but I did kind of. So,
Who are all the most opponent to the Mimamsas? First, I just want to ask this question and then
well, when?
normally, so to what to the which question Mimamsakas are it has developed their work. It can be a argument, vada, or something. So first is who. So for example, in Vedantic traditions, in some of them are countering. In Dvaita Vedanta, it is countering to that Advaita Vedanta. Similarly, like that, there Mimamsakas giving counter argument to the particular school.
Right.
If it is right, then who are all the main opponent?
So again, like I said, it depends on what period you mean. So, for example, there was a certain point in which the Mimamsakas were really pushing back against certain kinds of, for example, Buddhist Pramanavadins, right? And vice versa. Like Dharmakirti, for example, has has a lovely little passage of where he's saying that where he's talking about all the ways in which Mimamsakas are wrong. I think he says at one point, well, anyway, we'll talk about it another time. It's a fun little joke. But so that was important. Then there comes to be this kind of, there are two questions, right? Whom are the Mimamsakas responding to, and who is responding to the Mimamsakas? So Vedantins do tend to respond to the Mimamsakas, especially on the question of Arthavada, and obviously on Devata. But on Devata, they don't even usually engage very much. They just say that I mean, they just have their own position. At a certain point, it becomes nyaya, especially on questions of tatparya and how statements work and so on. So, in the late first millennium, it's kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, Mimamsa, Nyaya, and Buddhist Pramana kind of form a little set of people who are arguing with each other. Vedantins talk about Mimamsakas, but Mimamsakas don't seriously start talking about Vedantins until much later, right? So there'll be all Vedantins will be engaging with Mimamsakas in all sorts of different ways. Mimamsakas very rarely respond, especially on questions. So they'll sometimes make a reference to Swarga or liberation, but sometimes, for example, if a Vedantin is commenting on a particular use of a Mimamsa Nyaya, and if they're differing with Mimamsa, Mimamsakas don't even bother until the 16th, 17th century. Again, I keep talking about Apaya, but post Apaya, I think. But does that at all answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
So then second one is when it comes to the debate in what is the exact meaning to the passage of Shruti. So in this Yagena Swargam Bhavi. So Bhavana, what is that Bhavana? So why I'm asking this question is, so is this Bhavana will be a Bhavana in Sanskrit, some Bhavana it will be imagination. Or we are something this we need to every karya has to be with, engaged with phala. So this karma, which somayaga has to be a phala. That phala, we need to think there is one phala. That phala it is swarga.
So, sorry, please.
So is this bhavana, or if there in one homa prakriya or karika prakriya, if there is no phala, some only they randomly they just narrating the uh, procedure of that. If there is no phala to that yaga, do we need to bhavana? Why I'm asking is my understanding is bhavana. It is just we need to carry forward this phala somewhere else to here. Is this bhavana or something else?
So there are two different ideas, right? So there is kalpana and there is bhavana. These are completely different ideas in Mimamsa. So what you are seeing is more like kalpana, which I translate as postulation, right? So when there is no phala for a yaga, there is a nyaya according to which you postulate swarga as the phala, if there is no phala given, right? That's kalpana. Bhavana is not a cognitive thing in Mimamsa. Bhavana is the fact of something being brought into being, right? So it's not that you're postulating that there must be a result to this sacrifice. You're producing the result through the sacrifice. You're actually sort of, um, I'm not a philosopher, but to me, it seems like it's a process that produces something that is ontologically.
Is it similar to Apurva?
Ji?
Sorry. Is it intermediate function?
You're thinking more of Apurva.
Yeah, you're talking about those processes that are immediate. For example, maybe would you have an example? When the way you explain it, I
So,
can see
bhavana-
the process of if I put the butter there, there'll be smoke coming.
So bhavana, right? So bhavana has three parts, right? The phala, the sadhana, and the iti kartavyata, right? So the result, the means to the result, and the procedure. That is bhavana at the simplest. If that helps at all. The three together form bhavana, of which obviously only two can be enjoined, and the phala can't be enjoined. And the sadhana and iti kartavyata can be are known through vidhi.
So again, whenever we, for example, when they particularly the prakarana just deals with a specific angel, for example, Devata, Indra, is there any particular person are they addressing that Indra, for example, who is Indra, whose cat is that Vajrayana, that person is Indra. So these kind of narrations are there. In Mimamsakas, are they pretty apart from any Vedic meaning? Then one person as a devata. No.
These are terrible atheists.
That's what.
There's actually I mean, I always find it to be a little bit. I feel like it's anyway. But yeah, they're terrible atheists. They don't think that there are any deities. Any factual statements in the Veda are arthavadas. So if it says Vayuvai Kshivittha Devata, wind is the fastest god. Of course, there is no wind that is a god. It's only because it says Vayuvai Shvetamala Bheta. So because of that, you cognize somehow that the wind. They're saying wind is fastest god, so the sacrifice must bring result fast. So we should do this. That's it.
So I just again, it's
Yeah.
an advanced program. So if they are ready to believe on an external world, which is Swarga, then it is also a thing. But why they are not, why Mimamsaka is not ready to accept some another Atindriya path?
So-
which is, it can be Indra Devata, whatever they are not agreeing with.
Right. So
Atindriya.
here's how the Mimamsaka sees it, right? Swarga, of course, is Atindriya, and you can know it through Veda, right? Because Pratyaksha cannot grasp a future thing, so you can only know it through Shruti, right? Now, the thing with Devatas is that Mimamsa can't admit anything other than, so because everything has to be for the purpose of Kriya. Factual statements create lots of problems. The first problem with a factual statement is that if it says that Indra killed Vritra, for example, then that statement for the Mimamsaka must have been written after Indra killed Vritra, right? Which means that it was not eternal. It was not eternal, then we run into all sorts of problems, right? So one is in order to preserve the eternality of the Veda, and the other is that they will admit something is Atindriya in the future, right? You can't see it. But they say in the sacrifice, we don't ever see gods coming, right? So if something is present, then it must be cognizable.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was fun. But anyways, at some point in life, I will read the Seshwar Mimamsa properly.
However, the particular sect that is Vishishta Advaita Mimamsakas and Advaita Mimamsakas, in their interpretation of Kumarila and Prabhakara, they don't see them as Nirishwaravadins.
Well,
For two reasons. One is that Advaita, again, the Vyavaharikatva angle will
Exactly,
be a little
yeah.
complicated. But despite that, whether it is Shankara or his immediate predecessors, or the successors, all of them have highly advocated the importance of karma in terms of the tantra practices and so on. And in that they have emphasized spiritual entities that are the ones who help us overcome the Maya. So in that sense, and in Vishita Veda, of course, that just because uh, uh, in my lifetime I have not spoken about God does not mean that I don't believe in God. So just because Jaimini has not mentioned God, he has not negated God in the text.
But Kumarila has, in so many
But
words and very
Jaimini
loudly.
has not.
But both Shabara and Kumarila, I mean, Shabara has both, okay, Jaimini and Shabara both dismiss the idea of deities, whether or not they talk about a god, and Kumarila very loudly dismisses God for many, many verses in his commentary on 115.
This is one. And second is uh, Prabhakara doesn't seem to be dismissive of God.
But he is dismissive of gods. I mean, chapter 9 still exists. Again, the question of whether there is Ishvara or not and whether there are Devatas or not. The Ishvara question, I think, at least in Kumarila, is unambiguous. The Devata question, to my mind, seems very clear across the board. But yeah, I mean, yeah, not everybody goes out of their way to say that they don't believe in Ishvara as well as Devatas. Some of them just don't talk about. It's very clear that at least somebody like a Parthasarathi, in the rest of his life, is perfectly fine with God, but he tends to like to keep his Mimamsa persona in the rest of his life, except for the Mangala verses. He doesn't really get into it very much.
And in case of Bhaskara Raya, I don't know whether he was uh, contemporary of Srikanta or post Srikanta.
Well, he was definitely post Srikanta, but how much post depends on when you like to date Srikanta.
Okay.
I mean, you mean the Srikanta of
The
the.
Shakti Vishita Veda.
Yeah, so, I mean, Srikanta was presumably before Appaya, at least a couple hundred years before Appaya, because Appaya comments on it.
So then
Yeah.
he must be of 14th century.
At least.
At least.
Yeah.
Now, do you see that his Shakti, is there any influence of Srikanta over
Absolutely. Some of it comes through Appaya Dikshita. So Appaya has this work called the Shivadvaita Nirnaya, which I don't like. It's just like a spoiler. Then we won't have anything to talk about tomorrow. But he does. So a lot of the influence comes through Appaya. But I mean, obviously, he is he. I'm sure if he read the Shivarkamani Deepika, then I'm sure he's also obviously read the Mula. So yeah.
And do you see how is Bhaskara's response towards Shakti Vishita Advaita when he is, as you presented, that he advocates Advaita?
So he doesn't, I mean, he uses the phrase Shakti Vishishta. He doesn't really address Shakti Vishishta Advaita as a system. He alludes to certain ways, and so he quotes from Srikanta. Excuse me. He quotes from his work, the which is itself controversial, whether Appaya wrote it or Srikanta wrote it, and Appaya commented on it. He quotes from that in one of his Durga Saptashati commentaries, in his Durga Saptashati commentary. And he quotes from certain passages where Appaya is reading Srikanta using Advaita sources. So he does engage with it, but not systematically. He'll take ideas from certain texts and so on and so forth. The only system he bothers, the only Vedanta he addresses semi-systematically is Advaita. Again, I don't know what he does in that lost Vedanta work.
And now Bhaskara's Advaita, is it close to Kashmira
Yes.
Advaita or
Yes.
Shankara's Advaita?
No, it's exactly like the Kashmir. The Shaiva
And,
Lords.
is there a particular reason that that movement has influenced his practices, or
I mean,
they are from
the
different
Sri
era.
Vidya tradition in general
is Kashmir.
draws very much from the Shaiva non-dualist tradition. So to that extent, yes. I mean, I think of it the other way, which is that he gets it from the Shaiva non-dualist and he introduces Advaita into it rather than the other way around.
So he has nothing to do with Shankara's interpretation of Advaita.
Not really, not doctrinally. Again, God knows what he does in Chandabhaskara.
Any other online people, if they would like
Nobody
to
else has said anything or raised a hand.
no, if they would like to unmute themselves and speak.
I have a pedantic question.
Not at all, please.
Yeah.
I love pedantic questions.
Yeah. So what is the conception of bhakti according to Bhaskar Raya, which how it is different from the Narada Muni's bhakti sutra?
So he gets his definition of bhakti just from the Shandilya Sutras, just as it is, yeah. Paranuraktari.
And why bhakti is placed on the higher pedestal than the Upanishadic practice?
What's the force of the why? What kind of a why is this? As in,
The
why?
reason.
No, I mean, you mean in terms of this process of getting to God, or you mean why Bhaskara Raya rhetorically chooses to do it? So Bhaskara Raya, it's the way he does it. He also draws upon the Yoga Vasishta in that section in interesting ways. But the idea is that you get to the point where you understand perfectly what the Upanishad says, right? But he says after that, it's just a superior experience and relationship with God. You see this idea, and I mean, Srini knows this material better than I do, but sort of in the, again, mid to late second millennium, you see this in amongst the Vishishta Advaitins, you see this amongst the Gaudiyas and so on, where they say that you can have the non-dual experience, it's not a problem. It's just not as good. Right? So, for example, some Sri Vaishnavas have this idea of Kaivalya Moksha, right? So, you can have Kaivalya Moksha if you really want it, but it's just nicer to serve Narayana and Vaikuntha. Tulsi in the 16th century, in the Manas, says the same thing, right? He says, yes, of course, you can, a bhakta can merge with God whenever he wants, or whenever she wants to. But why would you want to if you can hang out with them? So, it's just better. Thank you so much.
Just stand.
What is happening? How much time?
Huh?
I can get up?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
So, good evening everyone. With deep reverence and gratitude, I extend this vote of thanks to Tarini ma'am for her enlightening lecture on Bhaskar Raya's Mimamsa. Today's session opened a gateway into the brilliance of Bhaskar Raya, whose interpretations continue to guide seekers and scholars alike. Madam, your lucid exposition of his philosophical depth, clarity of logic, and spiritual subtlety helped us grasp the essence of his commentary traditions. Through your lecture, we were reminded that Bhaskar Raya was not only a scholar but also a mystic whose works serve as shining example of how devotion and rigor and experiential wisdom can be harmonized. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your wisdom with us, deepening our understanding of such a towering figure in the Indian spiritual thought. We are truly grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was very helpful. Thank you.
I think we have some time. I have family obligation. I have to run, but
Okay.
see you tomorrow.
Good time. Yeah, have a good night. See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
See ya.
Thank you, everyone. We'll meet tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you.
Thank you.